The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, somewhere over the Hindu Kush Mountains. Major Kestrel Nighthawk, Valdez pressed her headset closer, straining to catch the transmission that would change everything. Below her massive C-130J Hercules, Afghanistan's treacherous terrain stretched endlessly in moonlit shadows, but something was wrong with this mission. The cargo manifest listed medical supplies for forward operating base Ironclad, yet the sealed containers behind her bore no medical markings, just numbers, cold, clinical numbers that made her stomach tighten with unease. "Nighthawk, this is Overlord," the voice finally pierced through the interference. "Divert to coordinates 34.2158 north, 68.8739 east, priority Alpha." Kestrel's co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus "Rookie" Patterson, shot her a questioning glance. Those weren't the coordinates for FOB Ironclad. They weren't even close. The new location sat deep in Taliban territory, a place where C-130s didn't belong, where the mountain winds could slam a 40-ton aircraft into rock faces without warning. But orders were orders, even when they felt like death sentences wrapped in military protocol. "Copy, Overlord. Adjusting course." Her voice remained steady despite the ice forming in her veins. 15 years of military aviation had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct screamed that this mission had been constructed on lies. The aircraft banked left, its 4 Allison T-56 turboprops fighting against the thin mountain air. Through the cockpit windows, jagged peaks clawed at the star-filled sky like skeletal fingers. Kestrel's weathered hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, but her mind raced. She thought of her 7-year-old daughter Emma, asleep in their apartment back at Ramstein Air Base, clutching the worn teddy bear that smelled of jet fuel and her father's cologne. Emma didn't know that Daddy was really Mommy in flight suit and helmet, that the heroic pilot in their bedtime stories was the woman who tucked her in each night. The military had never been kind to single mothers, especially ones who'd clawed their way into male-dominated cockpits through sheer determination. But Kestrel had learned to navigate more than just aircraft. She'd learned to navigate dismissive attitudes, condescending smiles, and the constant assumption that she was somehow less capable because she'd chosen to raise a child alone after her husband's death in Syria. Tonight, though, capability would be tested in ways the Air Force never trained for. The coordinates led to a valley that shouldn't exist on any official map, to a mission that felt orchestrated by ghosts, and to a confrontation with truth that would either destroy her career or elevate it to legend. The mountains waited below, silent and hungry, holding secrets that would soon spill blood across their ancient stones. And Kestrel Valdez, Calce Nighthawk, flew deeper into the darkness, unaware that she was about to become the most important pilot the military had never properly acknowledged. 20 minutes later, the ground fire began. The first tracer round painted a deadly orange arc past the cockpit, close enough that Kestrel could feel its heat through the reinforced glass. Below them, muzzle flashes erupted from hidden positions like deadly fireflies, and the distinctive crack of AK-47s echoed through the valley. This wasn't the simple supply run they'd been briefed for. This was an ambush, carefully planned and expertly executed. "Jesus Christ!" Patterson's voice cracked as another burst of automatic fire stitched across their starboard wing. "Nighthawk, we need to get out of here." But Kestrel's eyes had locked onto something else entirely. Through the chaos and gunfire she could see them, 12 figures in tactical gear, moving with the fluid precision of America's most elite warriors. Navy SEALs, stranded on a washed-out landing strip that looked like it had been carved from solid rock by explosives and desperation. They weren't supposed to be there. Hell, according to every briefing she'd received, no American forces operated in this sector. The radio burst to life with a new voice, gravelly and urgent. Any station, this is Trident 6. American forces in contact. Require immediate extraction. Grid 34.2158 north, 68.8739 east. The same coordinates they'd been mysteriously diverted to. The same impossible location where her C-130 now circled like a massive, vulnerable target. Coincidences like this didn't exist in military operations, only carefully orchestrated plans and the people expendable enough to execute them. "Rookie, take the controls," Kestrel ordered, her voice cutting through the engine noise and gunfire. "Keep her steady at 2,000 feet." Patterson's hands trembled as he gripped the yoke. At 26, he was technically qualified but practically green, the kind of pilot who'd never seen combat outside of flight simulators. His presence on this mission now seemed less like standard crew assignment and more like deliberate sabotage. Someone had wanted an inexperienced co-pilot, someone who might panic when things went sideways. Kestrel activated her tactical radio, switching to the emergency frequency. "Trident 6, this is Air Force Nighthawk. We're a C-130 overhead your position. What's your situation?" The response came immediately, tinged with disbelief and something that might have been hope. "Nighthawk, we've been compromised for 6 hours. Taliban forces have us pinned on 3 sides. That landing strip is our only exit, but it's been washed out by recent rains. No way a fixed-wing can put down on that surface. No way a fixed-wing could land." The words hung in the air like a challenge, like every dismissive comment she'd endured throughout her career condensed into a single, devastating assessment. They needed extraction, but they'd already written off her ability to provide it. Just another pilot, probably male, probably inexperienced, probably flying a routine cargo run who'd stumbled into their nightmare by accident. They had no idea who they were talking to. Kestrel keyed her mic again, her voice steady and professional. "Trident 6, what are your aircraft requirements for extraction?" "We need a helicopter, Nighthawk. Something that can hover and fast-rope, or at least put down on unimproved surfaces. We've got wounded and can't wait for CAS or medevac." She studied the terrain below, noting the landing strip's condition through her night vision. It was bad, rutted, partially washed away, barely 300 meters of usable surface bracketed by boulders and drop-offs. Any sane pilot would declare it unsuitable for fixed-wing operations and call for rotary-wing support. Any normal C-130 crew would circle overhead, provide situational awareness, and wait for the cavalry. But Kestrel Valdez wasn't any normal pilot, and the cavalry was 6 hours away. "Trident 6, be advised. Helicopters are not available in your sector. Closest rotary-wing assets are at Bagram, minimum 6-hour response time." The silence that followed spoke volumes. 6 hours was eternity when Taliban reinforcements were converging on your position. 6 hours meant capture, torture, and eventual execution broadcast across jihadi websites. 6 hours meant families receiving folded flags and hollow condolences from military bureaucrats. Finally, the SEAL team leader's voice returned, resignation bleeding through his tactical composure. "Copy, Nighthawk. Thanks for the attempt. We'll figure something out." They were writing themselves off, accepting death with the stoic professionalism that defined America's special operations community. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the woman circling above them, the single mother who'd spent 15 years proving that determination mattered more than assumptions. Kestrel switched to intercom, addressing her crew. "Rookie, I need you to listen carefully. We're going to attempt a landing." Patterson's face went pale in the instrument glow. "Ma'am, that strip is completely unsuitable for C-130 operations. Regulations clearly state." Regulations didn't write themselves for situations like this. Her hands moved across the pre-landing checklist with mechanical precision. "Those men down there are Americans. They're our people, and we're not leaving them to die because some manual says the ground isn't perfect enough." But even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her confidence. The landing strip wasn't just unsuitable, it was borderline suicidal. One mistake, One moment of hesitation or overcorrection, and her 40-ton aircraft would become a funeral pyre for everyone aboard, including her, which meant Emma would lose the only parent she had left. The radio crackled with movement reports from the SEALs. "Nighthawk, be advised. Enemy forces massing on our eastern perimeter. We estimate company-strength Taliban with technical vehicles. Time to contact, 15 minutes, maybe less." 15 minutes to execute the most dangerous landing of her career, load 12 special operators and whatever classified cargo they'd been retrieving, and get back into the air before overwhelming enemy forces overran their position. It was impossible by any reasonable metric, suicidal by most tactical assessments. Which meant it was exactly the kind of challenge that had defined Kestrel Valdez's entire military career. The kind of moment where being underestimated became the deadliest weapon she possessed. The first approach nearly killed them all. Kestrel lined up the massive C-130 with the washed-out strip, fighting crosswinds that seemed determined to slam them into the valley walls. At 200 feet, she could see the true extent of the damage. Water had carved deep gullies across the runway, leaving behind a surface that looked more like a moonscape than an airfield. "Nighthawk, abort!" The SEAL team leader's voice cracked with urgency. "That surface won't support your aircraft weight." But Kestrel had already reached the same conclusion. She pulled back on the yoke, feeling the Hercules respond sluggishly to her commands as they climbed away from the failed approach. Below them, muzzle flashes continued to erupt from Taliban positions, the enemy growing bolder as they sensed weakness. "Ma'am, we need to call this off," Patterson pleaded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cockpit's climate control. "There's no way we can put down on that surface safely." Kestrel ignored him, her mind already calculating alternatives. Standard landing procedures wouldn't work, but standard procedures hadn't been designed for situations where American lives hung in the balance. Somewhere in her 15 years of military aviation, in all those training exercises that pushed aircraft and crew to their absolute limits, was a solution. She just had to find it. The answer came from an unexpected source. Her loadmaster, Staff Sergeant Diana Wheels Kowalski, whose voice suddenly filled the intercom. "Major, what if we don't use the full strip? Just touch down on the most solid section, reverse thrust immediately, and keep the engines spooled up for rapid departure." It was brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. A tactical landing, barely controlled crash that would put them on the ground just long enough to load passengers before launching back into the night sky. The technique existed in theory, practiced by test pilots and special operations aviators, but never attempted in combat conditions by a cargo crew. "Wheels, that's suicide," Patterson whispered. "No," Kestrel said quietly, her hands already beginning the second approach. "That's what we trained for." She'd never told her crew about the classified operations she'd flown in Syria, the black missions that didn't officially exist in Air Force records. Missions where landing meant the difference between successful operations and international incidents, where precision mattered more than regulations. The Pentagon had buried those accomplishments deep in classified files, but they'd taught her things that no flight manual could convey. How to read terrain like a predator reads prey. How to make split-second decisions based on instinct rather than instruments. How to fly when failure meant more than just personal embarrassment. It meant body bags and grieving families and missions that would haunt commanders for decades. "Trident 6, be advised, we're coming in hot. Have your people ready for immediate boarding. 60 seconds on the ground, no more." The SEAL team leader's response carried a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Copy, Nighthawk, we'll be ready, and thank you." Thank you. Two words that carried the weight of 12 lives, of families who would see their loved ones again, of missions that might continue instead of ending in capture and execution. Two words that made the risk worthwhile, even if success seemed statistically impossible. The second approach began at dawn's first light. painting the Hindu Kush mountains in shades of gold and crimson that made the landscape look almost peaceful. Almost. Tracer fire still reached toward them from Taliban positions, but the enemy seemed confused by the Hercules' aggressive tactics. They'd expected a lumbering transport to remain safely at altitude, not dive toward their guns like a massive, four-engine fighter. Kestrel's hands moved with surgical precision across the controls, adjusting power settings and flap configuration as the runway rushed toward them. At 100 feet, she could see individual boulders scattered across the landing surface. At 50 feet, she could count the ruts and washouts that would destroy their landing gear if she miscalculated by even a few inches. 40 knots above normal approach speed, she muttered to herself, part of a mental checklist that had kept her alive through situations that killed other pilots. Power at 80%, ready to firewall on touchdown. Touchdown zone. There. She'd identified the only section of runway that might support a C-130's weight, a roughly 100-meter stretch where recent flooding hadn't completely destroyed the original surface. It was shorter than any cargo aircraft had ever used operationally, requiring split-second timing and absolute precision. One moment too early or too late, and physics would transform her aircraft into twisted metal and burning fuel. The massive Hercules touched down with brutal force, its landing gear absorbing impact that exceeded design specifications. Immediately, Kestrel reversed all 4 engines, feeling the airframe shudder as enormous turboprops fought to stop 40 tons of forward momentum. Through the cockpit windows, she could see the SEAL team already running toward their position, carrying wounded comrades and heavy equipment cases that definitely weren't part of any standard reconnaissance mission. 30 seconds. Kowalski's voice echoed from the cargo bay as she lowered the ramp, creating a bridge between the aircraft and salvation. Come on, people, move it. The loading happened with practiced efficiency that spoke to hundreds of combat operations and thousands of training hours. Navy SEALs didn't waste time or motion, even in desperate circumstances. They flowed up the ramp like water, carrying their wounded and their secrets with equal care. Whatever they'd been doing in this forgotten valley, whatever classified mission had gone sideways, would remain locked in their silence and her discretion. But Kestrel could see something in their eyes as they passed through her cockpit, something that looked suspiciously like respect. These were men who worked with the military's most elite aviators, pilots who flew the most dangerous missions with the most advanced aircraft. They'd seen the best of the best, and they were looking at her with recognition that transcended rank or gender or any other artificial distinction. They were looking at her like a pilot who just accomplished the impossible. The last SEAL aboard carried an equipment case that seemed to weigh more than one man should be able to lift. As he passed Kestrel's position, he paused just long enough to meet her eyes through the cockpit glass. His face was streaked with dirt and cordite, his tactical gear torn and blood-stained, but his expression carried something close to reverence. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "That was the finest piece of flying I've ever witnessed." Then he was gone, disappearing into the cargo bay as Kowalski began securing personnel and equipment for takeoff. But his words lingered, settling into the part of Kestrel's mind that had spent 15 years collecting evidence that she belonged in military cockpits, that competence mattered more than assumptions, that determination could overcome prejudice if applied with sufficient precision. "Ramp coming up," Kowalski announced. "All personnel secured for departure." Kestrel didn't wait for official confirmation. She released the brakes and firewall the engines, feeling the C-130 accelerate down the remaining runway like a massive, reluctant sprinter. They had maybe 50 meters of usable surface remaining when the Hercules finally achieved flying speed, clawing its way into the morning sky as Taliban forces converged on the abandoned landing strip below. They'd done it. Against regulations, against common sense, against tactical doctrine that declared such operations impossible, They'd successfully extracted 12 Navy SEALs from a situation that should have ended in capture and execution. And they'd done it because Kestrel Valdez had refused to accept limitations that others had placed on her capabilities. But as they climbed toward cruising altitude, she realized that the most dangerous part of their mission might still lie ahead. The cargo those SEALs had been protecting, the classified equipment they'd carried onto her aircraft, represented secrets that someone had been willing to kill for. Secrets important enough to risk America's most elite warriors in a valley that didn't officially exist. Secrets that might cost her everything she'd fought to build. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came 20 minutes into their flight toward Bagram Airfield. Kestrel was adjusting their heading when her secure radio erupted with a transmission that made her blood run cold. "Nighthawk, this is Overlord. You are ordered to divert immediately to Kandahar Airfield for cargo inspection and crew debriefing." Kandahar, not Bagram, where medical facilities waited for wounded SEALs. Not Ramstein, where she could finally hold Emma after the longest night of her life. Kandahar, where military intelligence conducted the kind of debriefings that could destroy careers and bury inconvenient truths in classified archives. Kestrel keyed her mic, keeping her voice professionally neutral. "Overlord, we have wounded personnel requiring immediate medical attention. Request direct routing to Bagram for casualty evacuation." The response came back immediately, tinged with the kind of authority that brooked no discussion. "Negative, Nighthawk. Kandahar is your assigned destination. Medical personnel are standing by." Medical personnel. Not the trauma surgeons and specialized equipment that wounded special operators needed, but military doctors whose primary function would be determining how much the rescued SEALs remembered about classified operations. How much they might reveal about missions that officially never happened. Patterson shot her a questioning glance, but Kestrel was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Someone wanted those SEALs isolated and debriefed before they could share details about their Valley mission. Someone with enough authority to override standard medical evacuation procedures, enough influence to redirect Air Force aircraft carrying Navy Special Operations personnel. Someone who might consider Kestrel Valdez and her crew acceptable casualties if their silence couldn't be guaranteed. She switched to intercom, addressing her team with careful words that wouldn't trigger monitoring systems. "All stations, be advised, we're experiencing navigation issues. Recommend emergency landing at nearest suitable airfield for equipment inspection." It was a lie wrapped in military protocol, a way of communicating danger without explicitly violating orders. Kowalski caught on immediately. 15 years of military service had taught her to read between lines that could mean the difference between career advancement and court-martial. "Copy, Major. Equipment definitely needs thorough inspection." But their passengers weren't fooled by diplomatic language. The SEAL team leader appeared in the cockpit doorway, his tactical awareness honed by missions where paranoia meant survival. His call sign, stenciled on his plate carrier, read Blackwater, a name that spoke to operations conducted in moral gray areas where conventional rules didn't apply. "Major, is there a problem with our routing?" Kestrel met his eyes in her peripheral vision, weighing risks and responsibilities in split-second calculations. These men had trusted her with their lives, had depended on her flying skills to extract them from an impossible situation. They deserved honesty, even if honesty might compromise her career. "Chief, how classified is the cargo you retrieved from that valley?" Blackwater's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, recognition that they shared professional understanding of situations where official channels became obstacles to survival. "Classified enough that certain people might prefer we never made it back to friendly territory." The words hung in the recycled air of the cockpit like a death sentence, disguised as military euphemism. Whoever had orchestrated the SEALs' mission in that valley, Whoever wanted their cargo badly enough to risk America's most elite warriors would view Kestrel and her crew as witnesses to operations that officially didn't exist. Witnesses who could be eliminated by mechanical failure, navigation error, or any number of accidents that befell military aircraft in Afghanistan's unforgiving airspace. Accidents that would generate sympathy and close casket funerals instead of uncomfortable questions about unauthorized operations and expendable personnel. Major, Blackwater continued quietly, my team has contingency plans for situations where extraction becomes complicated. We'd prefer to avoid implementing those plans, but we're prepared if circumstances require extreme measures. Contingency plans. Military speak for protocols designed to eliminate threats to operational security, including friendly forces whose continued existence posed unacceptable risks to classified missions. The fact that a Navy SEAL was discussing such possibilities with an Air Force pilot spoke to desperation levels that transcended service rivalry. They were all dead if they followed orders. The only question was whether they'd die slowly in military detention facilities or quickly in aircraft accidents that would be blamed on mechanical failure and pilot error. Kestrel made her decision with the same calculated precision that had guided her landing on the washed-out strip. Sometimes survival required breaking rules that other people had written for situations they'd never experienced. Blackwater, how do your contingency plans feel about emergency landings in Pakistan? The flight to Jacobabad would haunt Kestrel's dreams for years afterward, not because of the danger, but because of the conversations that took place in whispered tones throughout her cargo bay. Navy SEALs discussing options that would never appear in official after-action reports, Air Force crew members calculating fuel loads and flight times for destinations that didn't exist on approved routing charts. They were committing career suicide with military precision, violating international flight protocols and bilateral agreements with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized their entire service records. But the alternative, following orders that would lead to detention, interrogation, and eventual elimination, seemed infinitely worse than diplomatic incidents and court-martial proceedings. Pakistan's airspace welcomed them with radar interrogation that lasted exactly 37 seconds, long enough for air traffic controllers in Karachi to identify a United States Air Force C-130 operating outside established flight corridors, but not long enough to scramble interceptor aircraft or alert diplomatic channels about unauthorized border crossings. Jacobabad Air Base had been abandoned by the Pakistani military 3 years earlier, its runways cracked and overgrown but still capable of supporting heavy aircraft. More importantly, it offered the kind of isolation that allowed for conversations that could never be recorded in official transcripts. The Hercules touched down on deteriorating concrete as the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows that turned the abandoned airfield into something resembling a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Perfect cover for discussions between American military personnel whose continued existence had become inconvenient to their own chain of command. Kestrel shut down the engines and turned to face her crew, seeing her own resignation reflected in their faces. They'd committed themselves to a course of action that would end their military careers, but might preserve their lives long enough to see families and friends again. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, using the formal address that military personnel reserved for moments of supreme gravity, "we have approximately 4 hours before anyone notices our deviation from assigned routing. I suggest we use that time productively." Blackwater had been busy during their flight, establishing secure communications with contacts whose existence couldn't be acknowledged in official channels. The kind of people who specialized in making problems disappear, whether those problems involved inconvenient evidence or inconvenient witnesses. "Major, my team has assets who can provide alternative transportation and documentation. Clean extraction to friendly territory, no questions asked, no official records. But once we activate those assets, there's no going back to military careers or government employment. No going back. The words crystallized everything Kestrel had fought to build over 15 years of military service. Rank earned through competence rather than connections. Respect purchased with precision flying and uncompromising professionalism. Financial security that would ensure Emma's future regardless of what happened to her mother. All of it would disappear the moment she made this choice. Emma would grow up knowing that her mother had been a military pilot, but never knowing the full story of her final mission or the reasons she'd chosen exile over execution. But Emma would grow up. That fact alone made the decision bearable. "Chief, what about the cargo your team retrieved? The classified material that started this entire situation?" Blackwater's smile held no humor, only the grim satisfaction of a professional who'd spent his career preparing for worst-case scenarios. "That cargo, Major, was never recovered from the valley. Officially, our mission was a failure. The equipment was destroyed during extraction procedures, rendered completely unrecognizable by thermite charges and high explosives." Destroyed. The word carried implications that would ripple through intelligence agencies and military commands for months, as bureaucrats tried to reconstruct missions that had never officially existed. Whatever secrets those equipment cases contained would remain buried in Afghan valleys, protected by operational security protocols, and the professional silence of people who understood that some truths were too dangerous for public consumption. But the real secret, the fact that Major Kestrel Valdez had successfully extracted Navy SEALs from an impossible situation, using flying skills that defied conventional limitations, would survive in the memories of 12 special operators whose lives had been saved by a single mother from Texas, who'd refused to accept other people's definitions of what she could accomplish. That legacy seemed worth the sacrifice of everything else she'd built. The Pakistani contacts arrived exactly 4 hours after landing, driving vehicles that looked like civilian automobiles, but moved with the mechanical precision of military equipment. Their leader introduced himself simply as Khan, offering documentation that would transform 12 Navy SEALs and 4 Air Force personnel into private security contractors, with legitimate reasons for traveling through regions where American military personnel weren't welcome. "Major Valdez," Khan said, his English accented but precise, "your reputation precedes you. Certain elements within Pakistani intelligence have been following your career with considerable interest." Following her career. The word suggested surveillance networks and classified assessments that reached far beyond anything she'd imagined. Her flying skills hadn't just impressed American commanders. They'd attracted attention from foreign intelligence services, who understood the value of pilots capable of operations that defied conventional limitations. "There are opportunities," Khan continued, "for someone with your particular talents. Private military contractors who value competence over politics, who compensate their personnel based on results rather than rank structures or gender considerations. Private military work. The shadow world of deniable operations and corporate warfare, where former military personnel applied their skills to missions that governments couldn't acknowledge. It would mean steady income and operational independence, but also permanent exile from the country she'd spent 15 years defending. Emma would understand someday, when she was old enough to process concepts like national security and operational necessity. She would understand that her mother had chosen survival over career advancement, that sometimes the most patriotic action involved defying the orders of people who valued political expediency over American lives. But for now, Emma would only know that Daddy wasn't coming home, that their comfortable life at Ramstein Air Base was ending, that they would be moving to places where English wasn't the primary language and American military bases didn't provide familiar routines. The sacrifice felt infinite and worthwhile in equal measure. Kestrel spent her final moments as an active-duty Air Force officer walking the perimeter of Jacobabad Air Base, memorizing details that would fade from classified debriefings but survive in personal memory. The weight of her flight suit, tailored and adjusted through years of careful modifications. The sound of Pakistani wind across broken concrete, carrying scents of diesel fuel and distant cooking fires. The sight of her C-130 Hercules, sitting abandoned on a runway that would soon be reclaimed by weather and bureaucratic erasure. 15 years of military aviation, condensed into sensory impressions that no official record would ever capture. 15 years of proving that determination mattered more than assumptions, that competence transcended gender or family status, or any other artificial limitation imposed by people who'd never faced situations where failure meant death. Her secure satellite phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Emma's babysitter. "Daddy, when are you coming home? Emma misses you lots." Emma misses you. 4 words that contained entire universes of responsibility and love and sacrifice. 4 words that made exile bearable, that transformed career suicide into parental necessity, that reminded her why she'd chosen this path despite its terrible cost. She typed her response carefully, each word weighted with implications that Emma was too young to understand. "Soon, baby girl. Daddy has to finish one more important job, and then we'll start a new adventure together. I love you more than all the stars in the sky." More than all the stars in the sky. Their bedtime ritual, the phrase that had comforted Emma through thunderstorms and bad dreams and the normal anxieties of childhood. Soon it would have to comfort her through exile and displacement, and the knowledge that her father's heroic stories had become family secrets that could never be shared with friends or teachers. But Emma was resilient, had inherited her mother's ability to adapt to circumstances beyond her control. She would thrive wherever their new life led them, would learn languages and customs and survival skills that would serve her throughout whatever future awaited them. And someday, when Emma was old enough to understand concepts like courage and sacrifice, and the price of protecting innocent lives, Kestrel would tell her the complete story of their last night as Americans. How a single mother had refused to abandon fellow service members, how skill and determination had overcome impossible odds, how sometimes the most patriotic action involved defying orders from people who'd forgotten the difference between national security and personal convenience. But for now, all Emma needed to know was that Daddy loved her more than all the stars in the sky. The documentation con provided transformed Major Kestrel Nighthawk Valdez into Catherine Morrison, private security contractor, with credentials that could survive scrutiny from law enforcement agencies in 12 different countries. The identity came complete with financial accounts, employment history, and contact information that would redirect inquiries to answering services staffed by professionals who specialized in maintaining operational covers. Her Air Force personnel file would list her as killed in action during a training accident over the Arabian Sea. Aircraft and crew lost due to catastrophic mechanical failure with no recoverable remains. The kind of sanitized tragedy that generated sympathy and closed casket ceremonies, instead of uncomfortable questions about unauthorized operations and expendable personnel. Emma would receive survivor benefits and military death compensation, administered through trust funds that would ensure her education and financial security, regardless of what happened to her mother in the shadow world of private military contracting. It was a cruel kindness, financial security purchased with official death, maternal love disguised as bureaucratic efficiency. But it was also survival, which mattered more than sentiment when survival meant the difference between Emma growing up with a mother who'd been forced underground, and Emma growing up as an orphan whose parents had died for secrets that no one would remember in 5 years. The flight to Karachi took place in civilian aircraft with registrations that changed every time they landed. Pakistani military contractors who understood that deniability was more valuable than comfort, who specialized in transporting personnel whose continued existence was inconvenient to various intelligence agencies. Kestrel watched Afghanistan disappear through the aircraft window, knowing she would never see those mountains again as an active-duty American military officer. The Hindu Kush peaks that had nearly killed her now faded into memory, along with 15 years of service and sacrifice and professional accomplishment that would be erased from official records with bureaucratic efficiency. But the real accomplishments, the lives saved, the impossible missions completed, the proof that competence mattered more than prejudice, would survive in the memories of people who'd witnessed them firsthand. 12 Navy SEALs whose extraction had defied tactical doctrine, 4 Air Force crew members whose loyalty had extended beyond career considerations, and 1 7-year-old girl who would grow up knowing that her parent had been someone worth admiring. That legacy seemed sufficient compensation for everything else she was losing. The new identity came with new responsibilities, including employment with Meridian Security Solutions, a private military company that specialized in operations requiring pilots whose skills exceeded conventional limitations. The kind of work that paid better than military service but carried risks that no government insurance policy would cover. Her first assignment involved flying cargo aircraft in regions where traditional military operations weren't politically feasible, transporting personnel and equipment for clients whose identities remained classified even from the pilots who served them. It was Afghanistan all over again, but without the protection of military protocols or the comfort of serving a flag she'd spent her life defending. But it was also survival, and survival meant eventual reunion with Emma once diplomatic situations stabilized and new identities could be safely established. Catherine Morrison might be a stranger to military bureaucrats, but she would be the same loving parent who tucked Emma into bed every night for 7 years, who taught her to read and dream and believe that determination could overcome any obstacle. The money would help with transition expenses, with establishing new lives in places where American military records didn't determine social status. Emma would attend international schools where her diverse background would be considered an asset rather than a complication, where her father's heroic stories could be shared without endangering operational security. And someday, when enough time had passed and enough bureaucrats had forgotten about inconvenient witnesses to classified operations, Catherine Morrison would become someone else entirely, a mother and daughter reunion disguised as coincidental meeting, a family restored through careful planning and patient execution. But for now, Kestrel Valdez was dead, her legacy preserved in memory rather than official recognition, her sacrifice measured in the lives she'd saved rather than the career she'd abandoned. It was a trade she could live with, because living meant Emma would never have to choose between honoring her parents' memory and surviving in a world that had become too dangerous for their continued existence as Americans. The stars over Pakistan looked identical to the stars over Afghanistan, over Germany, over Texas, where Emma waited for a phone call that would explain why their bedtime ritual had been interrupted by circumstances beyond a 7-year-old's comprehension. The same constellations that had guided navigation before GPS systems and satellite communications, before military bureaucrats decided that competence was less important than political convenience. Those stars would continue shining long after the classified files were declassified, long after the bureaucrats who'd orchestrated this situation were replaced by other bureaucrats with different priorities. They would shine down on Emma's future, on opportunities and adventures that wouldn't have been possible if her parent had chosen official channels over operational necessity. And perhaps someday, when Emma was old enough to understand the full story, she would look up at those same stars and feel pride instead of loss. Pride in a parent who'd valued human lives over career advancement, who'd chosen exile over execution, who'd proven that love could be stronger than loyalty when loyalty was demanded by people who'd forgotten the difference between national service and personal convenience.